Hidden Agendas report. And today we're going to be discussing the O.J. Simpson trial. And with me is special guest, Detective Jason White of the Tulsa Police Department. Jason, how are you doing?
Good, Mike. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I am so glad to have you. You're very knowledgeable in these things, and that's the reason I wanted to have you on as a guest, because you and I have discussed the O.J. Simpson trial before. And, you know, that was a situation where on June 13th of 1994, that Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman were found stabbed to death out in front of her condominium. And both of the victims had multiple knife wounds, and Nicole had severe defensive wounds. What all can you tell us about your knowledge of this incident?
Well, this is going to be the Bundy location, and this is where Nicole Brown Simpson was actually living at the time of this incident, of course, and many people know what this. The younger generations, actually, though, are the ones that probably don't know a lot of the details about this case. But that's where Nicole was living. Actually, her and OJ were separated at the time, and of course, there was a mother load of knife wounds, and actually, with respect to Nicole specifically, she was nearly decapitated. Actually, and that was on the walkway leading up to the door of the residence. And so this is what happened back then, and that day, I can tell you that day there was a recital that had occurred where OJ and Nicole's child was performing at this recital, and there was a little bit of a domestic dispute going on there, where many people witnessed the fact that he was not happy with her, and that there was a back and forth, etc. So they were already in an argument earlier that day, and there was somewhat of a history of domestic assault and just domestic disturbances between the two of them. And so that's kind of where we start this story out, and to where that's the scene. Ron Goldman was just kind of there, and he was delivering something that she had left behind at
sunglasses. I believe it was sunglasses.
Right.
She had left those at a restaurant where he worked, and he was returning them, and that was around between 10:15 and 10:40 p.m.
Correct. And that restaurant doesn't actually exist any longer. But it was where that she was dining and with her family. And Ron Goldman was one of the waiters that was at that location. And it's, I wouldn't be surprised at all if there wasn't some sort of maybe she left them on purpose kind of a deal. Who knows? But he went to retrieve them, and he volunteered to take them to her, and unfortunately met his fate. And it was likely OJ that is the person that showed up over there and was not happy.
Okay, let me ask you this. The blood evidence itself, where all was it found at the scene?
Well, there's going to be blood on a number of different areas, not only blood, but we're talking footprint impression, shoe print impression evidence, Bruno Maglia shoes that were a very expensive version of a shoe that actually there was evidence of him actually wearing that specific type of shoe. And that was when he was actually on TV, doing the sidelines of football games. And I remember that. You'd see OJ all over the place. You saw him on Hertz commercials to whatever. And they actually had footage of him wearing those exact shoes that would have matched that shoe impression on the sidelines. And so there was also some blood evidence on the gate or the fence leading out of the scene on the sidewalk that appeared to be as that it would have been leaving. And there's blood pattern analysis that indicates that it was probably him leaving. And another thing that's interesting, and this is something that I'll add in there, is that years and years ago, I had an opportunity to speak with Vincent Bugliosi. And Vincent Bugliosi is the one that wrote Helter Skelter. He's written that. He's written another book called And the Sea Will Tell, and a couple of other books, if I'm not mistaken. But Vincent Bugliosi was the prosecutor on the Manson murders. And he actually called me at home pre-cop days, and I wanted to talk to him about Helter Skelter, but he wanted to talk about his other book, which was called Outraged. And in that book, he basically he details, he's outraged. That was the premise of the book, because of all of the evidence that basically pointed to OJ in reference to this case. One of the things that I can remember vividly him telling me about was the fact that there was actually a blood stain, at least one, if not more than one, on her back. And it was basically a blood stain belonging to him on her back.
Right.
And it's something that I think that the prosecution should have, there's a lot of things that should have happened in this particular case, but it's one of those vital pieces of evidence that apparently they just didn't hammer home enough. But that was pretty telling.
If I recall, there was blood in his Bronco. There was blood at his home on his socks.
Yes,
and
we're not talking just blood like in a area that could have happened from something else, kind of a deal. We're talking blood that is literally on like the center console and on the seat and on the door and in areas that, to me, I would say, and that's Nicole's blood, by the way, and likely his as well. But that's definitely her blood that's in the Bronco on socks that were freshly taken off in his bedroom, on the glove that was found behind the guest house that Cato Kalin, which, by the way, he's going to be on my podcast coming up right around the corner. But that's the guest house that Cato was staying in, and there's a glove that was behind there, and so forth. So there's just a ton of evidence actually that links him to the scene, and her blood linking to the house. And so the naysayer would say, well, hey, she lived there at some point in time. But we're talking about blood that is relative. I mean, honestly, it's fresh blood. I mean, they were on this pretty quick. Okay. So it's not like it was 2 days or 3 days or 4 days later. We're talking, they were on this that night, where the body had been discovered that night.
Yeah, it's bizarre that you can have so much evidence. And of course, we know that he had cut himself. And his story was that he was in a hotel, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong. No, and that he dropped a glass in the sink and it cut his finger whenever he was trying to get some of the glass picked up or whatever. And that was the reason he came up with the cut on his hand.
Well, that's what he told the investigators, that he had cut his hand on a broken glass in a hotel room in Chicago. And he had caught the red eye that was basically the late flight that leaves Los Angeles to go do that. And I think it was for, if I'm not mistaken, it might have been for a football game that he was going to be doing. I don't know for sure, but I know that the limo driver was Alan Parks, and Alan Parks went to that residence to pick him up. He had to wait a little bit longer it's like he kept knocking or ringing the doorbell, and he had to wait a period of time, which he thought was a little strange. And that, essentially that OJ was acting a little bit out of sorts, maybe a little out of breath. And OJ just claimed that, I think if there's some of this stuff that I'm not going to remember, but the beauty is what's interesting, and I'll mention this, Mike, just to your listeners, you can watch the entire trial on YouTube. They put that up there on YouTube, all of it. And it's actually fascinating. And so you can hear each one of these witnesses talking about it.
It really is, because back then DNA evidence was a new thing. That was one of the first trials. That's the first one I knew of where they actually brought out DNA as evidence.
That's correct. As a matter of fact, DNA was first used in a courtroom in 1986. And that's, they've known that there was building blocks of life, like there was something different in like 1857, if I'm not mistaken. But the main dates for criminal justice purposes is like 1986. And that was used in a murder trial in England. And they got a conviction. But this trial specifically, and I'm not going to say that it was the first, but it was one of the first that was actually on television, on court TV. This one actually is the reason for like the E! Channel and many other channels actually starting up. But so those channels were televising this live, and fortunately they did. But this is one of the first times that the general public was able to sit in front of their television sets. And believe me, I think that the world was glued to the television, and because everybody knew OJ from television, from just him being on there.
Do you think the jury back then understood the DNA evidence?
No, and to tell you the truth, I've been in homicide almost 17 years, and there's a lot about DNA I don't understand. I mean, it's of a scientific level for them to try to explain this, but really at this point, shortly before this case, really, what the jury would find is they would hear that the only thing they could really tell was that the suspect was O positive, or there was O positive at the scene, or A positive, or A negative. So this is really one of the first times that the general public, by and large, was able to sit in front of their television set and hear about this DNA. They knew that they'd probably heard of it, but now they're getting an explanation, not only from the prosecution side, but really the world's foremost expert. Honestly, I'm going to say he's probably one of the biggest experts, and that's Barry Scheck, one of the defense attorneys from the Dream Team.
The thing that got me was, I think the simplest thing that Clark and Darden could have done was just said, "Hey, DNA is very similar to a fingerprint. It's unique."
Well, it is. It is. It's unique. It's an identifier. And that's why many jurisdictions across this country today are able to obtain a DNA swab at the time of arrest if it's a violent offense, because they've argued it's really no different than a fingerprint.
It's just so odd that they missed so many opportunities to explain this away. Let's move on and get to the Bronco chase. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I mean, everybody across the world, of course, if you were anywhere near a television set, you would be introduced to this Bronco chase. And, there's a lot of other stuff that happened before this. I mean,
Sure.
it just didn't happen to the chase. I mean, OJ had already been subjected to a polygraph. At least he agreed to do one. And the results of that were not favorable to OJ, but they are not they're not admissible in a court of law. It's just kind of an indicator. And, he had already done an interview with the police. It was a very short interview, not long enough. I think the time frame of that interview was like 30 to 40 minutes at best. And so after all of this stuff had transpired, and we're talking a little bit later into the investigation, there was a time when OJ happened to be in this white Bronco driven by Al Cowlings, and they were trying to stop him because basically OJ was supposed to turn himself in, is what was supposed to happen. And they were trying to, once they found out about that, actually it was Tom Lang, one of the detectives Tom Lang is still alive. Van Adder was the other detective in this case, the main detectives. And so those two detectives were around back then. Well, Tom Lang actually had got on the phone with OJ trying to convince him that you need to just turn yourself in, OJ. I mean, one of those deals. And at that time, OJ had a gun to his head and he was going to kill himself. Not necessarily the behavior of an innocent person.
No, it's not.
It's not. And so that's kind of what was on. And you had people cheering him on the side of the interstates and et cetera.
Yeah, it's kind of bizarre. I was at the ballpark when that took place, and we were watching it on TV at the time. And, there was roughly 95 million people that watched it. And, a live event like that, for me, it was kind of like the Kennedy assassination. You remembered right where you were when you heard the news.
Yeah, that Bronco still exists. Actually, for your listeners, if you happen to want to see the Bronco, you can't get in it, but it exists in Alcatraz East Museum, which is located in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, and some other iconic cars are actually there, to include one of Ted Bundy's VWs that he would abduct women in. So they've got some cars. That's one of the cars that's there, actually.
Huh. That's amazing.
Which incidentally, it'd be kind of neat just as an experiment to go back and luminol that this many years later, just to see if you get anything,
Yeah.
I think that'd be fascinating, but it still exists. And that it was a gift from Hertz to do the commercials, if I'm not mistaken. And that was kind of one of the things that they gave him.
Well, you had mentioned that they had a history of domestic disputes and violence. I know that OJ pleaded guilty at one time to physical abuse of Nicole.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of drama. There were the police officers were familiar with. They'd been to the house before. They had dealt with him, and I don't know so much about that. I know that there was some incidents where the police were involved. Certainly, that did come up in the trial, and you got to remember that the LA County District Attorney's Office is comprised of a lot of attorneys. I couldn't give you the number, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's not hundreds. And in this particular case, unfortunately, you've got Christopher Darden and you've got Marsha Clark that, from my opinion, just from seeing them on TV, and I'm talking as now being a homicide detective of almost 17 years, they were by far overmatched. I mean, just in the
Yeah.
attorney world. I mean, we've got F. Lee Bailey, we've got Kardashian, we've the best of the Barry Sheck, and all these guys that were a part of that team that
Well, that's the reason they called them the Dream Team.
Alan Dershowitz. I mean, I don't know of another case where you had a team that was comprised of these names of that level of
No.
attorneys. In any case, before or since, actually.
Yeah. Well, I think it was in 1989 when Simpson pled no contest to spousal abuse after police found that he had beaten and bruised Nicole. And, that became a major issue in the trial. In the recording, I believe that she was telling the dispatcher in one of these calls that, this is Nicole Brown. I'm married to O.J. Simpson. You guys know all about this, that sort of a thing. But, it became the trial of the century, is what they were calling it back then. And it began in January of 1995 and lasted for about 9 months. I can't imagine what our YouTube has on there. But
Well, the other thing I got to mention this to you, Mike. I think this is important to mention. There's a lot of bits of circumstantial evidence that exist in this case that I think they were mentioned. I remember them being mentioned, and one of them was a witness that at least one witness, if not more than one, actually witnessing OJ in his Bronco in that time frame, in that level of time, speeding it from the direction of where Bundy is located to the area of where the Rockingham address is. I've been to both, Mike. I was just at the Bundy address literally in October. So it's however many months that is, like 5 months ago. I was 4 or 5 months ago. I was actually sitting in front of the Bundy location, and Rockingham actually is not that far from where the Bundy location is. So, but when you have a witness that's seen a white Bronco driven by OJ, who is one of the most recognizable people on the planet, and he's rushing from that area, that's a pretty big piece of evidence or a clue that something. I mean, it definitely fits what is going on here. Furthermore, the way his vehicle was parked out on the street, in front of the residence. He didn't even go through the gate. He actually parked it out on the street. And incidentally, that residence, the Rockingham residence, was actually purchased and since been torn down with another house that's there. But the wall is still there out in front of the residence. But so those are the kind of pieces of evidence that I think that when you take all of these little pieces to the puzzle, it really tells the story.
Well, we've talked about the glove some. Can you tell us about the one that was found at the residence by the guest house?
Well, about that, we're still talking about that time frame, that window of time, and Cato Kalin's inside of the guest house. He lived in the guest house, and he kind of would run around. And actually, as a matter of fact, I think he went to McDonald's earlier that night with OJ, and so he's in the guest house, and that's when he hears a thud up against the back wall. And he hears it. It startles him, of course. Yeah. And so that just so happens to be the area where and I think that he probably told the officers when the officers went there and knocked on the door and, hey, did you know anything? You hear anything? And I'm sure he told them about the thud against the wall. He did. He told them about that. So they naturally go back there to look. And that's when they found one of the gloves, the glove that had her blood on it. And that's the glove that they asked him to try on during the trial, which was kind of a bad idea,
Yeah,
actually.
it really was. You know, for me, Cato Caitlin made the trial interesting. I thought he was a fun witness, to say the least. But wasn't it was Mark Fuhrman was a central figure in all this because of some of the statements he had made, and I think the defense kind of targeted him for some of the things that he had said, tried to make it appear that he had planted evidence and everything else.
Yeah, they did. I think that, they tried to make this look to be a huge conspiracy of the police officers trying to frame OJ. And you got to remember, there's a history here before this happened. And we had oh gosh, what's his name? Basically, I can't believe it just escaped me, but basically beaten by the police before this incident had happened, which created the LA
Rodney
riot.
King.
Yeah, Rodney King. So the Rodney King thing had happened not too terribly long before this. They'd had the LA riots before this. When you take into account that the LA County prosecutors or the LA County District Attorney's Office has never really had a good track record of prosecuting famous people in that area. They've just not. I mean, you look at Robert Blake, who was accused of killing his wife. You look at the Menendez brothers for the first trial, and you look at there's a lot of other people too that have went on trial there that were found not guilty. It's just not a good place to when you have famous people just have a hard time believing that person could actually do something like this. But when you look at the injuries and you look at the personal nature of these injuries, when you consider the fact that about 95% of all murders are committed by somebody that knows the victim, when you see that the history, which is very telling in this particular case, where there has already been a history of domestic assault, and there's also been just domestic abuse, verbal abuse, psychological abuse, a long history. And when you take all that into account, along with the physical evidence, I think that the defense did a really good job they did a really good job, and the prosecution did a very poor job when it came to voir dire, which is the selection of the jury. And that is a very, very important process that takes place on any case, but even really on this case.
Yeah, what a lot of people don't think about is the fact that here you had this dream team of attorneys, every one of them at the top of the game at the time. And all they had to do was convince one juror. And
yeah, that's true.
And with the makeup of the jury, I don't think they had a chance to start out with. And I also look at the prosecution, and I think that Marsha Clark and Chris Darden thought they had a slam dunk.
Well, they did, and you don't ever ask a question you don't know the answer to. And when they didn't object to the fact of him trying on that glove, you got to remember who you're dealing with. You're dealing with an actor.
Right.
And not only that, but he's wearing a rubber glove when he puts on the glove, and that's already going to be. You try to put on a glove with a rubber glove, and then you take into account, which they never even addressed, is the fact that gloves are going to shrink, leather gloves, after they've been wet. And these things, we're not just talking a dot of a speck of blood. We're talking a lot of blood. And so when you think of that, then you might ask yourself, well, then how would you have blood at the scene? How is that possible? Well, because he cut his hand and he cut his finger. And in doing so, that blood has, you're going to have a little bit of blood that's left behind. It wasn't a lot of blood, but it's enough that tells part of this story. And so that's part of the thing that, and I'll tell you right now, just to your listeners, if you think that anything that I'm saying, because there's always going to be somebody out there that goes, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, listen, I'm talking about what was talked about in this trial. If you want to hear the real deal, Tom Lang is still alive. By the way, I've been trying to get him on my podcast. But Tom Lang is still around, and is actually, they put out a recent documentary in reference to this, where he's talking about a lot of these items of evidence that were never introduced in trial, that he's been furious about since this happened.
Yeah.
And and also Tom Lang, he's been on some infamous cases, to include the Wonderland murders, actually. and that was one of the cases that he kind of helped on, and he was part of the unit where they actually worked
Oh,
the big time famous people cases kind of
you know,
deal.
one thing that we haven't addressed is we talk about OJ and his hand being wounded. Um, of course, he was being trained by a Navy SEAL for an upcoming TV series.
That's right. Yep,
And
that's right.
a lot of people on, you know, here's a guy that apparently used a knife to murder two people, and he was being trained by the best. And yet he managed to cut himself, leave all kinds of evidence behind. And with everything else that you've mentioned, you know, I just find it amazing that they couldn't get a conviction. But it goes back to the jury, the makeup there. It's kind of like I run into with the Pusser case. You're never going to be able to convince 12 people, I don't believe, that Buford murdered Pauline. And the same thing was here with OJ. He was a legendary athlete. Everybody thought the world of him, and nobody could believe he did it.
You know, I remember when that verdict came in. I actually was standing in a surgery, and I was a scrub tech back in the day, and we were operating on somebody, and I can remember I just couldn't believe it. I was in a state of shock, as was most of this country. That I thought that is the biggest miscarriage of justice I've ever heard of, and I would record that trial and watch it every night when I would get home. I could still recite many of the names of the people that were involved. And there was other things that were going on in this case too that were attacked. It wasn't just against Mark Fuhrman. And the defense was claiming that Mark Fuhrman was a racist, and I'm not saying he was or not. He had made some serious inappropriate statements that were inflammatory and not, you know, they weren't acceptable. Let's just put it that way.
He didn't help himself at all in this trial.
No, he didn't. And they were setting him up, and they had a recording of him, et cetera, saying the N-word, which was inappropriate anytime. But even then, they're trying to claim that there was a conspiracy with several police officers. And I'm not just talking about Van Adder, Lang, Fuhrman, other main detectives that I don't remember their names. Dennis Fung, who I think Dennis Fung was one of the criminalists on this case that actually left some evidence in the trunk of his car, things like that. I can tell you this much, just from working in this industry for as long as I have, there is always something that the defense can find to scrutinize and critique. And why didn't you do this? And why didn't you do that? And that really was their best play, because in this time, you got to remember, as I stated earlier, you had some distrust with the police department, with the LAPD specifically, from the community. And then when you stick people on a jury that are, you know, what is the saying? The saying is, and I don't mean any disparaging thing against jurors, because there's been some exceptional jurors that I've met in my lifetime, some of which are my friends today, that are very smart people. Yeah. But they always say that if you're on a jury, then you know you weren't smart enough to get off of it, basically. And so I don't know. I would have loved to have been on that jury. I'm waiting to get called up for jury duty where they could sequester me for the next 9 months to a year. Pitched. I know, but I would volunteer to be sequestered for like the next year. I think it'd be cool. But yeah, they picked a jury, and I've heard some of these jurors talk over this many years later, and they still think that they made the right decision. And I think that they're just, I mean, they were able to successfully find some people that they have to be morons. I don't know how else to put it. I will say this: I am not 100% convinced. I'm not 100% convinced that he did this solely by himself. I think he did. I feel pretty confident he did, but there's a lot of speculation that there could have been somebody with him and that participated in this. And I've heard that. I've heard his son, which I don't really believe. I've also heard another guy that he happened to be running around with at this time frame that actually is sitting in prison, and he's a serial killer that was running around with OJ back in the day. I don't know. What I would like to see happen, honestly, Mike, and I don't mean to be going on here, but I want to mention this. I would like for the LAPD to go back and re-examine all of the evidence with the technology that exists today. They found him not guilty. I could almost promise you that OJ never called the police department to ask him where they were at on that case after he was acquitted. Okay. And even though he said that he was going to be out searching for the killer, well, he searched for him on a lot of golf courses. That's for sure.
I was going to make the same observation. I mean, he checked out every golf course he could looking for the killer.
He did, but and this isn't the only case. I do think that it would be interesting, and it would be worth the money to go back and retest items of evidence from that location. Period. Because I just don't see how you could possibly get all of that blood on that. I know what they're saying. Oh, Mark Fuhrman planted the glove. To have a conspiracy for him to be involved with all of these other cops is just not possible. It's not.
It's like, did Mark Fuhrman leave all the blood evidence there in front of her condominium? Did Mark Fuhrman put it in the Bronco? Did Mark Fuhrman put it on OJ's socks?
Right.
I mean,
and it's kind of disheartening to me, honestly, and it's disheartening to me where we had it down the line where what it appeared that you had Black Americans thinking, oh, they were cheering, and then you have Caucasians or whites over here on this side that were disgusted. I hated the fact that there was such a division straight down the line, where people were celebrating on one side and people were we're all supposed to be, the scales of justice are supposed to be blind, and race should never be part of your consideration when considering somebody's guilt or innocence. And
it was right after the Rodney King situation, and
I know,
like we said, LA was just out there on all this. And I don't think there's any way that you could keep the factor out of the OJ trial at that time.
Well, I think you had the ingredients for it right then. I mean, that's why the dream team was there, and they clued in on when they had that. They really didn't have much else to go after. Actually, that's what they do. Defense attorneys are always going to attack the collection of the evidence. They're always going to attack your honesty. That's normal. And of course, when they discovered that about Mark Fuhrman and they caught him lying on the stand, and then after that, they're asking him questions that are normal questions that every single one of them, he's taking the fifth, which is the Fifth Amendment to not self-incriminate yourself. Did you plant evidence? I take the fifth. I mean, it's a yes or no. You either did or you didn't. I don't see a reason why you'd have to take the fifth on that, but that's what he did. And I'm still a little bit shocked that he's been able to, basically, he was the most hated cop on the planet, after this case. And somehow he's been able to recoup his reputation somewhat to where even at times he's been a talking head on networks, from time to time, still to this day.
Let's talk for just a moment. We're going to be in a situation here time-wise, but let's just mention the difference between a criminal conviction and a civil trial conviction, because the Brown family won the civil trial. Yes. And of course, the criminal trial, OJ was acquitted. I mean,
the criminal is beyond a reasonable doubt. And so anybody could really be sued civilly. I have to say this, Mike, I was a little bit troubled by this. He was found not guilty, even though in my heart I know he's guilty. I believe that he's guilty. I still, it didn't sit well with me that he was able to be sued civilly after being exonerated, basically found not guilty. I always kind of thought that, even though like I said, I don't have any doubt in my mind that he did this, but they ended up finding him. They ended up suing him for $33 million, or they ended up getting awarded $33 million in a civil setting. And the reason why is because they don't have to have it beyond a reasonable doubt. It's the preponderance of the evidence, which means that they think the preponderance, and so it's not even near to the level of beyond a reasonable doubt.
No, the two standards just don't match up in any way.
No. And now he never paid them a dime. Incidentally, there was never anything that the family that they received. If I remember, I've heard this, that they had never really received anything, and they couldn't touch his pension from the NFL. So, that's just the way it happened. I think it would have been really interesting. I'm kind of curious, and I'd like to know this. And if I ever had a chance to talk to Tom Lang, there's a few things that I'd like to ask him. I'd like to ask him, how was it, during visitation with the kids? I mean, did Nicole's family, I mean, did they continue on with visitation of these kids? That the
Yeah.
drop off, et cetera. I'd like to know how that was, because I think that would have been really, really interesting.
Well, let me say before we get off here that the one lasting impact to me was the fact of how forensic evidence is now viewed, and then also the media culture, how it changed. Like you said, networks that weren't networks became exactly that. But on the other end, with the forensic evidence, it has brought law enforcement a long way into people's understanding of things. Now you look at all these true crime shows that are out there, and it's amazing that how much forensic evidence has come out since then.
Well, I mean, the media coverage alone we're seeing it right now in the Guthrie case. It's overwhelming for an investigator to have the media hammer come down on a case like that, like it did in that Guthrie case. And that's the disappearance of Miss Guthrie in Tucson.
Right.
This was a case that you had people that were in a lottery to try to get a seat in the trial. You have every network probably in the world, I mean, honestly, that was standing outside of this place. And that's a huge amount of pressure on any investigation. I'm going to have John Bueller on my podcast, who is one of the main detectives in the Lacey Peterson case from Modesto, California. And they dealt with the same thing there. And it's just an incredible amount. And when you have a lot of talking heads, the regular talking heads that are scrutinizing every step of everything you say, do, and everything, and speculating on what people should do, it's just that's a huge problem.
It really
on some
is.
of these cases. It really is. And when you see the Guthrie case, I just think that's something that we probably should. If we're running out, I get it. I know we're running out of time, but I think that's something that really we need to kind of pull back on the reins a little bit and let the investigators do their job. And
we really should.
Then we really should, because I think that's when you pressure the police and you keep that's when mistakes are going to get made. And that's when potentially somebody could get arrested that didn't do it. And we need to really be sure on things like this and so forth, and make sure we do our due diligence to do the right thing, and have evidence to support our decisions to do so.
Last question, my friend.
Yes.
What case are you working on now? What number?
I've been the lead on 119 homicides. I've assisted on approximately 600, and I don't know how many more I've got in the tank, but I'll tell you what, I still am very, very passionate about what it is that we do. And we have a duty to the public to do the right thing and to be 100% correct.
Yeah.
And anybody that is in this business that doesn't think that way probably should find another line of work. And we owe that to the public, and we have that, their trust in us is priceless. And we can't jeopardize that at any rate. And so, just like you say, Mike, the truth has no agenda, and we just have to go where the truth leads us, and do the best that we can. This is a great case. I'm glad you brought this up. I love talking about it, especially since I was just there, and I know that you're going to have other cases that we'll probably talk about down the line. And I think
I was going to say, I hope to have you back to talk about Manson.
Absolutely.
I would really like to express my appreciation to Detective Jason White for being here today. It's always such a pleasure to have him on, because he is so knowledgeable about all of these things. So with that, we'll get off here. I'll say, as I always do, truth has no agenda, and thanks for watching.